Before the swords, before the glory, there was fire and pain. In the forgotten hills of ancient Dacia, one man's life was forged in flames hotter than hell. His sweat didn't earn coins, it earned survival. Each hammer blow echoed like a heartbeat in a world choking on ash, war drums, and betrayal. You'll hear his story, not as a legend, but as a warning. Because behind every gleaming blade was a back-breaking day, a burned hand, and a silent scream. And when the Romans came, his forge didn't just shape weapons, it hid secrets, revenge, and the last hope of a dying people. Close your eyes now, and let yourself settle into the comfort of your bed. Feel the softness beneath you, the gentle weight of your covers, the safety of your walls around you. Tonight, we're going to journey back nearly 2,000 years, to a time when the world was a much harsher place, when survival depended on skill, strength, and the ability to turn raw earth into the tools of life and death. You're about to meet the Dacians, a proud people who lived in what we now call Romania, nestled in the Carpathian Mountains. These were not primitive tribes, but sophisticated metalworkers, warriors, and craftspeople who created some of the finest weapons and jewelry of the ancient world. Yet their lives were defined by hardship, by the constant threat of war, and by the backbreaking labor required to coax precious metals from stubborn earth. Imagine yourself transported to their smoky workshops, where the air was thick with ash and the rhythm of hammers against anvils marked the passage of each grueling day. Feel the heat on your face, smell the acrid smoke, hear the distant sound of war drums echoing through mountain valleys. This is a world where every piece of metal was precious, where every sword could mean the difference between freedom and slavery, where the metalworker's craft was both blessing and curse. Tonight, you'll experience what it truly meant to work with fire and iron in ancient Dacia, from the first grey light of dawn to the last dying embers of the forge. You'll understand why these skilled craftspeople, despite their invaluable talents, lived lives of constant toil, perpetual danger, and ultimate tragedy as the mighty Roman Empire closed in around them. Let the warmth of your bed embrace you as we begin this journey into the smoke-filled world of the Dacian forge. Waking before the sun, hammer in hand. The darkness before dawn in ancient Dacia was absolute, broken only by the faintest glow of banked coals in the forge. You are Zamalxes, a master metalworker in a hillside settlement overlooking the Danube River, and your day begins while the world still sleeps. The wooden floor of your modest dwelling is cold against your bare feet as you rise from your straw mattress, your joints already aching from decades of hunching over anvils and bellows. There is no gentle awakening in your world, no leisurely stretch toward consciousness. The forge demands attention, and metal waits for no one. You pull on your leather apron, already stained black with countless hours of soot and sweat, and wrap strips of hide around your forearms, primitive protection against the flying sparks that will soon fill the air around you. Your hands, permanently darkened by charcoal and scarred by countless small burns, know their work by feel alone. The path to your workshop winds down the hillside, past the sleeping quarters of other craftspeople and the larger homes of the village nobles. Even in darkness, you can smell the residual smoke from yesterday's work, that acrid mixture of burning charcoal, heated metal, and the peculiar sharp scent that comes from working with raw iron ore. It clings to everything, your clothes, your hair, even your food. You've long since stopped noticing it consciously, but visitors to your settlement always wrinkle their noses and comment on the smell that follows the metalworkers wherever they go. Your workshop is a modest stone structure, built partially into the hillside for protection from wind and weather. The thick walls help contain the heat of the forge, but they also trap the smoke, creating an atmosphere that would be unbearable to anyone not accustomed to this life. You push open the heavy wooden door and immediately feel the residual warmth from yesterday's fire. The forge is the heart of your workspace, a carefully constructed stone hearth with clay-lined walls that can withstand temperatures hot enough to make iron malleable. Before you can begin the day's real work, there are preparations. The bellows, 2 leather bags connected to wooden pipes, need checking for cracks or holes that would reduce their efficiency. You run your hands along the leather, feeling for weak spots that might have developed overnight. A faulty bellows means insufficient heat, and insufficient heat means wasted fuel, wasted time, and potentially ruined work. In a world where resources are precious and margins for error are thin, such failures can mean the difference between prosperity and hunger. You gather kindling from the neat pile you maintain beside the forge, small, dry twigs and shavings that will catch quickly and help build the fire to the intense heat required for metalwork. Each piece is carefully selected. Green wood creates too much smoke, overly dry wood burns too quickly, and damp wood wastes precious fuel while producing inadequate heat. This knowledge, accumulated over years of trial and error, represents wisdom that cannot be found in any scroll or teaching, but must be earned through countless mornings just like this one. The first sparks dance upward as you coax flame from the banked coals of the previous day. Slowly, carefully, you feed the growing fire, watching as the orange glow strengthens and begins to throw dancing shadows across the stone walls of your workshop. The heat feels good against your face in the pre-dawn chill, but you know that within an hour, this same heat will become an oppressive force that will test your endurance throughout the long day ahead. Bellows, bronze, and the burn of ash. As the fire builds to the necessary intensity, you begin the rhythmic work of the bellows, a task so fundamental to metalworking that it becomes as natural as breathing. Your apprentice, a boy of perhaps 14 summers, arrives as the first grey light appears in the eastern sky. His job is to maintain the steady, consistent flow of air that keeps the fire at the precise temperature needed for your work. It sounds simple, but it requires strength, endurance, and an almost musical sense of rhythm. The bellows work demands constant motion, push, pull, with the timing adjusted based on the color and behavior of the flames. Too fast, and you waste precious breath and energy; too slow, and the temperature drops below the critical point where iron becomes workable. The boy's thin arms already show the development of muscles specific to this task, and his face bears the permanent flush that comes from working so close to intense heat for hours at a time. Today's primary task involves working with iron ore that was smelted several days ago into rough ingots. The raw metal bears little resemblance to the finished products it will become. It's crude, dark, and shot through with impurities that must be hammered out through repeated heating and working. You select a piece roughly the size of your fist, knowing that by the time it's properly refined and shaped, it will be reduced to perhaps half its current mass. The iron goes into the fire, and you wait, watching for the telltale changes in color that indicate readiness. Cold iron is dark gray, almost black. As it heats, it progresses through a spectrum of colors, first a deep red, then cherry red, then orange, and finally to the bright yellow-white that indicates it's hot enough to work effectively. This color judgment is crucial. Too cool, and the metal will resist shaping and potentially crack. Too hot, and it becomes dangerously close to melting, ruining hours of preparation. While waiting for the iron to heat, you prepare your tools. The hammer, your most important instrument, is a carefully balanced piece weighing perhaps 2 pounds, with a handle worn smooth by countless hours of use. Its striking surface is kept meticulously clean and properly shaped. Any nicks or irregularities in the hammer face will transfer to every piece of metal you work. Beside it lie various specialized tools: tongs for gripping hot metal, punches for creating holes, chisels for cutting, and forming tools for creating specific shapes and textures. The anvil dominates the center of your workspace, a massive block of iron mounted on a thick wooden stump that's been driven deep into the earth floor. Its surface is mirror smooth from years of use, and its edges are sharp and clean. This anvil represents a significant investment. A good anvil costs more than most families see in several seasons, and a master metalworker's reputation often rests as much on the quality of his anvil as on his skill with the hammer. When the iron reaches the proper heat, you lift it from the fire with long-handled tongs, moving quickly but smoothly to the anvil. The metal glows like a piece of captured sunlight, radiating heat so intense you can feel it through your leather apron. The first hammer blow rings out across the workshop, a clear, musical note that speaks of properly heated metal and precise technique. Sparks fly with each strike, tiny droplets of molten metal that dance briefly in the air before cooling to dark specks on the floor. The work is hypnotic in its rhythm: heat, hammer, but each blow must be precisely placed and carefully controlled. Too hard, and you risk cracking the metal or driving impurities deeper into its structure. Too soft, and you waste the critical moments while the iron remains at working temperature. Your movements are economical and practiced, developed through years of repetition until they become as automatic as walking. Between heating cycles, you examine your work closely, running your fingers over the cooling metal to feel for flaws, inconsistencies, or areas that need additional attention. The iron speaks to you through touch. A slight roughness here indicates an impurity that needs more hammering. A subtle variation in thickness there suggests uneven heating in the last cycle. This tactile knowledge, combined with visual assessment of color and spark patterns, guides every decision in the shaping process. Brewing beer for strength, not taste. As the morning progresses and the heat becomes more oppressive, you pause for refreshment, but not the kind of drink a modern person might expect. Water, while available, is often unsafe to consume directly, especially in a settlement where many people and animals live in close proximity. Instead, like most Dacians, you drink beer, but this is not the refined beverage of later times. Dacian beer is a nutritious, mildly alcoholic drink made from fermented grains, thick enough to provide sustenance as well as hydration. Your wife prepared this morning's batch several days ago, following a process passed down through generations of women in your family. Barley, wheat, and sometimes oats are ground into coarse flour, mixed with water, and allowed to ferment with wild yeast that exist naturally in the environment. The result is a cloudy, somewhat sour liquid that provides calories, vitamins, and minerals essential for sustaining the intense physical labor of metalworking. The beer sits in clay jugs arranged near the workshop entrance, positioned to stay cool but not so far that retrieving a drink requires a significant interruption of work. You lift a jug to your lips and drink deeply, feeling the lukewarm liquid cut through the metallic taste that perpetually coats your mouth from breathing forged smoke. The beer tastes of grain and fermentation, with an earthy undertone that speaks of the clay vessels in which it's stored. It's not particularly pleasant by modern standards, but it's wholesome, safe, and provides the energy needed to swing a hammer for hours on end. Your apprentice drinks from his own, smaller jug, his young face scrunching slightly at the sour taste. He's still adjusting to the adult beverages of the workshop, having recently graduated from the watered-down versions given to children. The beer affects him more strongly than it does you. His movements become slightly looser, his conversation more animated, but this is considered normal and even beneficial. The mild alcohol helps dull the pain of burns, cuts, and muscle strain that are inevitable parts of the metalworker's life. Between swallows, you discuss the day's work with your apprentice. He's learning to read the visual cues that indicate proper heating, the subtle differences in spark patterns that reveal the metal's composition, and the complex relationship between hammer technique and final product quality. His questions reveal both eagerness to learn and the gaps in understanding that can only be filled through experience. You remember asking similar questions of your own master, decades ago, and how the answers that seemed mysterious then now feel as natural as breathing. The beer break also provides an opportunity to assess the morning's progress. Several pieces of iron have been refined and are cooling near the anvil, their surfaces now smooth and clean, ready for the next phase of work. The fire burns steadily, maintained by your apprentice's consistent work with the bellows, and the workshop has reached that optimal temperature where everything flows smoothly, hot enough for efficient work, but not so hot as to be unbearable. The weight of every sword. The afternoon's work focuses on a commission that weighs heavily on your mind, a sword for one of the village's young warriors. This is not merely a tool or decorative object, but a weapon that may determine whether its bearer lives or dies in the conflicts that seem increasingly inevitable as Roman legions probe deeper into Dacian territory. The responsibility of creating such an implement is both an honor and a burden that you carry with every hammer blow. The sword begins as several pieces of iron, each carefully selected for specific properties. The spine of the blade requires metal that is strong but flexible, able to withstand the shock of combat without breaking. The edges need harder iron, capable of holding a keen cutting edge through extended use. These different pieces must be forge welded together, heated until nearly molten and then hammered into a single, unified whole, creating a blade that combines the best properties of each component. The process is demanding and unforgiving. The iron pieces must be heated to exactly the right temperature simultaneously, brought together at precisely the correct moment, and welded with hammer blows that are both powerful and precise. Too cool, and the pieces will not bond properly, creating weak spots that will fail under stress. Too hot, and the metal itself begins to burn, becoming brittle and worthless. The margin for error is measured in seconds and degrees. You've made dozens of swords over the years, but each one presents unique challenges. The iron itself varies from batch to batch, depending on the quality of ore and the efficiency of the smelting process. The weather affects how the fire burns and how quickly metal cools. Even your own physical condition, the steadiness of your hand, the accuracy of your eye, the strength behind each hammer blow, influences the final result in ways both subtle and profound. As you work, shaping the rough blade through repeated heating and hammering, you think about the young man who will carry this weapon. You've known him since childhood, watched him grow from a mischievous boy into a promising warrior. His family has paid you well for this sword, not just in metal and grain, but in promises of protection and alliance that bind your households together in the complex web of obligations and loyalties that define Dacian society. The blade slowly takes shape under your hammer, transforming from crude metal into something approaching its final form. The basic profile emerges first: the long, tapering point designed for thrusting, the gradually widening body that provides strength, the shoulders where blade meets hilt. Each section requires different techniques, different approaches to shaping and refining the metal. The fuller, a shallow groove running down the center of the blade, is particularly challenging to create. This feature serves multiple purposes. It reduces the sword's weight without significantly weakening it, and it helps prevent the blade from binding when thrust into an opponent's body. But creating a fuller requires specialized tools and techniques, careful attention to symmetry and depth, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of swordsmiths. Your apprentice watches intently as you work, occasionally offering to tend the fire or retrieve tools, but mostly absorbing the subtle lessons that can only be learned through observation. He sees how you test the blade's flexibility by bending it slightly, listening for any sounds that might indicate hidden flaws. He watches you examine the metal's grain structure in areas where previous hammer work has revealed the internal composition. Most importantly, he observes the patience and care you invest in each step, understanding that excellence cannot be rushed or shortcuts taken. The sword represents more than just metalworking skill. It embodies the entire social and economic structure of your community. The iron came from ore mined by specialists who risked cave-ins and exhaustion to extract it from the earth. The charcoal that fuels your fire was made by colliers who spent weeks in the forest, carefully controlling the burning of hardwood to create fuel that burns hot and clean. The knowledge you apply comes from master craftsmen who spent lifetimes perfecting techniques and passed them on through generations of apprentices. As the day wears on and the sword nears completion, you begin to think about the finishing work that will occupy tomorrow, the careful grinding and polishing that will bring the blade to its final sharpness, the creation of the hilt and guard that will protect the wielder's hand, the delicate balance adjustments that will make the weapon feel alive in its user's grip. Each of these steps is crucial, and each carries the potential for failure that could ruin days of work. The rhythmic hammering continues as shadows lengthen across the workshop floor, the steady percussion marking time like a heartbeat that measures not minutes or hours, but the gradual transformation of raw material into finished artifact. This sword, like all the weapons you create, will outlast you by decades or perhaps centuries, carrying forward not just your skill but your hopes for the young warrior who will wield it and the community that depends on his strength and courage. By evening, as you bank the coals for the night and clean your tools, the weight of responsibility settles on your shoulders like the leather apron you finally remove. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new commissions, new opportunities to shape metal and, through it, the fate of your people. The hammer rests beside the anvil, patient and ready, while outside your workshop, the sounds of the settlement gradually quiet as another day of endless labor draws to its close. The rise of the Dacian war chiefs. In the flickering light of your forge, as you work the bellows and shape hot iron, the rhythmic hammering seems to echo the distant sound of war drums that have become increasingly common in recent months. You are living through a time of transformation, when individual Dacian tribes are being forged together much like the metals you work, heated, hammered, and shaped into something stronger and more unified than the sum of their parts. The man responsible for this great transformation is Biebista, though you know him more by reputation than personal acquaintance. He began as simply another tribal chief among many, ruling over a territory perhaps a few days' travel from your own settlement. But unlike the other chiefs, who seemed content with their traditional borders and seasonal raids, Biebista possessed a vision that extended far beyond the familiar valleys and hilltops of his homeland. You first heard of him several seasons ago, when traders brought news of unusual alliances being forged to the north. Where once the various Dacian tribes spent their energies fighting each other over cattle, territory, and honor, Biebista began proposing something unprecedented, a confederation of tribes united under single leadership, capable of standing against the growing Roman threat that loomed ever larger beyond the Danube River. The idea was radical, almost incomprehensible to people accustomed to thinking of loyalty in terms of family, clan, and immediate neighbors. Your own chief initially dismissed Biebista's ambassadors, sending them away with polite but firm refusals. The notion of submitting to a distant authority, of placing the warriors of your settlement under the command of someone they had never seen, seemed to violate everything that defined Dacian independence and pride. But as the months passed and Roman expeditions probed deeper into Dacian territory, the wisdom of Bubista's vision became increasingly apparent. Individual tribes, no matter how fierce their warriors or strong their fortifications, could not hope to match the disciplined legions and sophisticated siege equipment of Rome. Only through unity could the Dacians hope to preserve their way of life, their traditions, and their freedom. The transformation did not happen overnight, and it was not accomplished through words alone. Buebista proved himself not just as a visionary leader but as a skilled military commander, capable of the kind of strategic thinking that had been foreign to traditional Dacian warfare. Where tribal conflicts had typically involved raids, ambushes, and brief, violent encounters, Buebista introduced concepts of coordinated campaigns, sustained sieges, and the kind of disciplined formations that could meet Roman legions on something approaching equal terms. You remember the day when your own chief finally accepted Buebista's leadership. The decision came after a particularly troubling report from scouts who had observed Roman engineering units surveying river crossings and potential routes through the mountain passes. The reality that Rome was planning not just raids but actual conquest had finally become undeniable, and with it came the recognition that traditional tribal independence was a luxury your people could no longer afford. Iron for war, preparing for Rome's advance. The integration of your settlement into Buebista's confederation brought immediate changes to your work as a metalworker. Where once your commissions came primarily from local warriors seeking to replace worn weapons or young men preparing for their first battles, you now found yourself part of a much larger effort to arm and equip what was effectively becoming a national army. Representatives from Buebista's court arrived at your workshop one morning, accompanied by your own chief and several of his advisors. They carried with them detailed specifications for weapons and armor, standards that would ensure compatibility and uniformity across the entire confederation. The casual individualism that had characterized Dacian metalworking, where each smith developed his own techniques and each weapon reflected personal preferences, was being replaced by something approaching mass production. The new requirements were demanding. Sword blades needed to be exactly 26 inches long, with specific measurements for width, thickness, and weight distribution. Spearheads required standardized socket dimensions to fit uniform shaft sizes. Even arrowheads, traditionally the most varied and personal of weapons, needed to conform to specifications that would allow for efficient production and distribution across the Confederation. Initially, you resented these restrictions. Your reputation had been built on the distinctive quality of your work, the subtle variations and personal touches that marked your weapons as superior to those of lesser smiths. The new standards seemed to reduce your craft to mere mechanical repetition, stripping away the artistry and individual expression that had made metalworking a source of pride and personal satisfaction. But as you began working within the new constraints, you discovered unexpected benefits. The standardized designs had been carefully developed by the most skilled smiths in the Confederation, incorporating the best features of various regional traditions. The precise measurements ensured optimal performance characteristics while minimizing material waste. Most importantly, the uniform specifications allowed for much more efficient production, enabling you to create more weapons in less time without sacrificing quality. Your workshop expanded to accommodate the increased demand. 2 additional apprentices joined your original student, and you constructed a second forge to handle the volume of work required. The settlement's leaders provided additional iron supplies, drawing on stockpiles that had been accumulated through trade and tribute relationships with mining communities in the mountains. Charcoal production increased dramatically, with entire families dedicating themselves to the careful process of creating the high-quality fuel essential for metalworking. The rhythm of your days changed as production demands intensified. Where once you might spend several days perfecting a single sword, carefully refining every detail until it met your personal standards, you now worked within more compressed time frames while maintaining the quality standards demanded by military necessity. The challenge was not just technical but psychological, learning to take satisfaction in efficient production rather than leisurely perfection. Your apprentices adapted more easily to the new pace, having known no other system. They learned to work in parallel, with one tending the fires while another shaped rough blanks and a third performed finishing work on nearly completed pieces. The workshop took on the characteristics of a small factory, with each person responsible for specific tasks in an assembly process that could produce a finished weapon every few days rather than every few weeks. Smelting in secret, protecting the tools of resistance. As Roman patrols began appearing with increasing frequency along the southern borders of Dacian territory, the importance of maintaining weapons production became matched by the necessity of concealing it from enemy observation. Roman intelligence was sophisticated and thorough. They understood that disrupting Dacian metalworking capabilities would be far more effective than simply defeating armies in the field. Your workshop, like others throughout the Confederation, began operating under new security protocols. Smoke from the forges, previously allowed to rise freely and disperse in the wind, was now channeled through underground passages that dispersed it at locations far from the actual metalworking sites. The continuous glow of forge fires, visible from considerable distances during nighttime hours, was concealed behind carefully constructed baffles and screens. The sounds of metalworking, the rhythmic hammering that had always marked the presence of active smiths, became a security concern requiring creative solutions. Your workshop was relocated to a partially underground facility, built into the hillside with thick stone walls that muffled the sounds of production. Work schedules were adjusted to minimize noise during daylight hours when Roman scouts might be active in the vicinity. Raw materials had to be acquired and transported with new levels of secrecy. Iron ore, charcoal, and finished weapons could no longer move openly along established trade routes. Instead, they traveled by hidden paths known only to trusted guides, often moving at night and using natural features to avoid detection. Your supplies arrived irregularly and in smaller quantities, requiring careful planning to ensure continuous production despite uncertain delivery schedules. The security measures extended to the finished products as well. Weapons could not be stored in the quantities necessary for equipping large military units without creating obvious targets for Roman raids. Instead, they were distributed immediately upon completion, cached in hidden locations throughout the territory, or integrated into normal community activities in ways that would not attract attention from casual observers. You learned to recognize the signs of Roman surveillance, the subtle changes in local wildlife behavior that indicated the presence of foreign observers, the appearance of strangers asking innocent questions about local crafts and industries, the slightly altered travel patterns of traders and merchants who might be gathering intelligence for enemy commanders. This knowledge became as essential to your survival as your technical skills with hammer and anvil. The psychological pressure of working under such conditions was considerable. Every sound outside the workshop might indicate approaching danger, every unfamiliar face could represent a potential threat, every routine interaction carried the possibility of inadvertent betrayal. The simple act of practicing your craft, which had once been a source of pride and community recognition, became fraught with dangers that extended far beyond the traditional risks of burns, cuts, and accidents. Your family adapted to the new reality with the stoic resilience that characterized Dacian responses to adversity. Your wife learned to prepare meals that produced minimal smoke and odor, reducing the chances that cooking fires would reveal the location of your concealed workshop. Your children understood without explicit instruction that certain topics could not be discussed outside the immediate family, and that strangers' questions about their father's work required careful, neutral responses. Betrayal at the forge. The betrayal, when it came, arrived in the form of someone you had trusted completely. Marcus was a trader who had been bringing iron ore to your workshop for several seasons, a man who claimed Dacian ancestry despite his Roman name and whose knowledge of local customs and language seemed authentic and complete. His supplies were always of good quality, his prices fair, and his manner friendly without being overly familiar. You first began to suspect something was wrong when Marcus started asking questions that went beyond normal commercial interest. He inquired about production schedules, wanted to know how many weapons you typically completed in a given time frame, and seemed unusually interested in the destinations of your finished products. Initially, you attributed this curiosity to natural business concerns, a supplier wanting to understand his customers' needs and capabilities. But gradually, other details began to seem suspicious. Marcus always arrived at your workshop alone, despite the fact that ore transport typically required multiple pack animals and assistants. His knowledge of Roman military equipment was surprisingly detailed for someone who claimed to have spent his life in Dacian territory. Most troubling, he seemed to know things about Roman troop movements and activities that would not normally be available to a simple trader. The revelation came during a late evening conversation when Marcus, perhaps made careless by the beer you had shared, mentioned specific details about Roman siege techniques that you knew had not been used in any conflicts within Dacian territory. When you questioned him about the source of this knowledge, his explanations were vague and inconsistent, raising doubts that quickly hardened into certainty about his true loyalties. You faced an agonizing decision. Marcus knew the location of your concealed workshop, understood your production capabilities, and was familiar with the security measures you had implemented to avoid Roman detection. If he was indeed a Roman agent, this information would be invaluable to enemy commanders planning operations against Dacian metalworking facilities. But confronting him directly would alert him to your suspicions and potentially accelerate whatever intelligence-gathering mission he was conducting. The choice was made for you when one of your apprentices reported seeing Marcus in the company of individuals who were definitely not Dacian, men whose clothing, weapons, and bearing marked them clearly as Roman soldiers. The meeting took place in a secluded valley several miles from your settlement, at a time when Marcus had claimed to be traveling to distant sources on your behalf. Working with your chief and other community leaders, you developed a plan to neutralize the threat while minimizing the risk to your operations. Marcus would be allowed to return to your workshop as normal, but would be provided with false information about production schedules, weapon caches, and defensive preparations. Meanwhile, the real metalworking facilities would be relocated to backup sites that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. The deception required careful coordination and considerable risk. Marcus was observant and intelligent. Any obvious changes in routine or behavior might alert him to the fact that his true identity had been discovered. You continued to work at the original workshop during his visits, but focused on producing inferior weapons and decorative items rather than the high-quality military equipment that was your real priority. The psychological strain of maintaining this deception while continuing essential war production was enormous. You had to act naturally around someone you now knew was working to destroy everything you were fighting to preserve, smile and share meals with a man whose ultimate goal was the enslavement of your people, and continued to appear trusting and cooperative while planning for his eventual elimination. The silence of the smithy after defeat. The end, when it finally came, arrived with shocking suddenness. Roman legions, guided by intelligence that included detailed maps of Dacian metalworking facilities provided by Marcus and others like him, struck at multiple locations simultaneously. Your primary workshop, despite all the security measures and concealment efforts, was overrun in the first wave of attacks. You were working at one of the backup facilities when the news arrived, brought by a blood-soaked messenger who had ridden hard through the night to warn surviving smiths of the disaster that had befallen their colleagues. The Romans had not simply destroyed the workshops, they had systematically dismantled them, carrying away tools, raw materials, and anything else of value while putting the smiths themselves to the sword. The loss was not just material but psychological. These workshops represented generations of accumulated knowledge, tools that had been perfected through decades of use, and facilities that had been carefully positioned and equipped to maximize efficiency and security. Rebuilding would require not just new materials and locations, but the time to recreate the complex relationships between smiths, suppliers, and customers that made large-scale weapons production possible. Your surviving colleagues scattered, some fleeing to remote mountain locations where they hoped to continue working in secret, others abandoning metalworking entirely in favor of less dangerous occupations. The Confederation's military leadership tried to maintain organized resistance, but without a reliable supply of weapons and equipment, their options became increasingly limited. You yourself continued working for several more months, moving from one hidden location to another as Roman search parties systematically hunted down the remaining metalworking facilities. The constant relocations made efficient production almost impossible. By the time you had set up a new forge and established working routines, intelligence reports would indicate approaching danger and force another hasty evacuation. The quality of your work suffered under these conditions. Weapons produced in hastily constructed temporary forges, using unfamiliar tools and inconsistent fuel supplies, could not match the standards you had maintained during more stable times. Your apprentices struggled with the stress and uncertainty, making mistakes that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Gradually, the network of suppliers and distributors that had supported weapons production began to collapse. Ore miners were killed or fled to Roman territory, charcoal producers abandoned their forest camps, and the warriors who needed weapons were either dead, captured, or scattered in ineffective bands that could no longer coordinate their activities or provide payment for metalworking services. The final blow came when Buebista himself was assassinated, killed not by Roman agents but by Dacian nobles who blamed him for the disasters that had befallen the Confederation. With his death, the unity he had created dissolved almost instantly, as individual tribes reverted to traditional patterns of local leadership and limited cooperation. Your last commission was a knife for your own son, a simple tool that he would need in whatever future awaited him under Roman rule. As you shaped the blade in the fading light of what you knew would be your final forge fire, you thought about all the weapons you had created over the years, swords that had defended Dacian freedom, spears that had turned back Roman advances, axes that had cleared forests for new settlements. Now the forges were cold, the anvils silent, and the proud tradition of Dacian metalworking was reduced to scattered individuals working in secret, creating simple tools for survival rather than weapons of resistance. The hammers that had once rung out across the valleys like heartbeats of a living culture now lay buried or broken, and the smoke that had marked the presence of skilled craftsmen no longer rose toward the sky. In the growing darkness, you banked the coals one final time, knowing that when they cooled, an entire way of life would have come to an end. Gold bracelets and the Dacian crown. In the quiet hours after the forge has cooled and your tools rest beside the anvil, your thoughts often turn to the mysteries that surround your craft, objects and techniques that speak of knowledge and purposes beyond the immediate needs of daily survival. Tonight, as you sit in the fading warmth of your workshop, your fingers unconsciously trace the outline of a golden bracelet hidden beneath your woolen sleeve, a piece so extraordinary that its very existence challenges everything you thought you understood about Dacian metalworking. The bracelet came to you through your grandfather, passed down through generations of metalworkers who understood that some objects transcend mere craftsmanship to become repositories of cultural memory and spiritual significance. Its construction defies easy explanation. The gold is purer than anything you've ever worked with, shaped using techniques that seem to require tools and methods unknown to contemporary smiths. The surface bears intricate patterns that appear simple at first glance but reveal increasing complexity the longer you study them. These spirals and geometric forms are not merely decorative, they follow mathematical principles that govern the movement of celestial bodies, the growth patterns of plants, and the flow of water through mountain valleys. Your grandfather claimed they represented the fundamental structures that underlie all of creation, knowledge preserved from an earlier age when Dacian smiths possessed understanding that has since been lost or deliberately concealed. The gold itself presents puzzles that you've pondered for years without reaching satisfactory answers. Analysis by touch and visual examination suggests a purity that should be impossible to achieve with known refining techniques. When you've attempted to work similar gold obtained through normal trade channels, the results bear no resemblance to the ancient bracelet's flawless surface and perfect malleability. Either your ancestors possessed metallurgical secrets that have vanished, or this object originated from sources entirely outside the normal patterns of Dacian craftsmanship. The bracelet's weight distribution is equally mysterious. Despite its substantial mass, it sits comfortably on the arm without creating the fatigue or discomfort that typically results from wearing heavy ornaments for extended periods. The balance seems calculated to work with the body's natural movements rather than against them, suggesting knowledge of anatomy and physics that goes far beyond what would be necessary for creating simple jewelry. More puzzling still are the stories associated with similar objects found throughout Dacian territory. Traders speak of golden spiral bracelets discovered in remote mountain caves, always in locations that show no evidence of permanent habitation but bear traces of metalworking activity that ceased centuries before living memory. These sites invariably feature stone formations that seem too regular to be natural, arranged in patterns that echo the designs found on the bracelets themselves. Your own attempts to recreate such objects have met with consistent failure. The gold you work with, no matter how carefully refined, lacks the distinctive properties of the ancestral pieces. Your tools, despite being crafted with all the skill you possess, seem inadequate for achieving the precision and perfection evident in the ancient work. Most frustrating of all, the mathematical relationships that govern the spiral patterns resist your efforts to understand their underlying principles. The bracelet represents more than just superior craftsmanship. It embodies a worldview that sees metalworking as something approaching sacred practice. The ancient smiths who created such objects apparently understood their craft not merely as a means of shaping useful items from raw materials, but as participation in fundamental creative processes that govern the structure of reality itself. The spirals carved into golden surfaces mirror the spirals found in seashells, pine cones, and the arrangement of stars in the night sky. This philosophical approach to metalworking suggests that your ancestors possessed not just technical knowledge but spiritual insights that have been largely forgotten by contemporary Dacian society. The evidence lies not only in objects like your bracelet but in the locations where similar items have been discovered, places that seem chosen for their relationship to natural phenomena rather than their convenience for conventional metalworking activities. Ritual tools or weapons of power? The distinction between sacred and secular objects becomes increasingly blurred as you contemplate other mysterious artifacts that have come to your attention over the years. Chief among these is a collection of curved knives discovered in a sealed chamber beneath one of the region's oldest hill forts, blades that appear to be weapons but incorporate design elements that suggest ceremonial or ritual purposes. These knives, which you've had the privilege of examining during a gathering of master smiths several seasons ago, challenge conventional understanding of Dacian metalworking in ways that go beyond mere technical sophistication. Their blades are forged from iron that has been worked to a hardness approaching that of steel, using methods that remain incomprehensible despite careful study by the most skilled craftsmen in the Confederation. The hafts of these mysterious knives are wrapped in gold wire worked into patterns that serve no obvious practical purpose but create visual effects of startling beauty and complexity. The wire itself is finer than anything you've been able to produce, drawn to dimensions that seem to approach the theoretical limits of what should be possible using hand tools. The patterns it creates shift and change as the knives are moved, creating optical illusions that make the weapons appear to pulse within a life. More puzzling than their construction is their apparent purpose. The blade shapes are unlike anything in the conventional Dacian arsenal, too curved for efficient cutting, too broad for precise stabbing, too heavy for throwing. Yet they show clear evidence of use, with microscopic chips and wear patterns that indicate they were employed for cutting through materials of extraordinary hardness. The nature of these materials remains a mystery, as nothing in the contemporary Dacian environment would require such specialized tools. The discovery context provides few additional clues. The sealed chamber contained no other artifacts, no human remains, and no evidence of the kind of accumulated debris that typically marks long-term use of storage spaces. The knives were arranged in a precise geometric pattern on a stone platform, surrounded by traces of substances that analysis has failed to identify but which leave behind a metallic residue unlike anything produced by known smelting or refining processes. Local oral traditions offer tantalizing but contradictory explanations for such objects. Some stories describe them as weapons wielded by legendary heroes in conflicts against supernatural enemies, beings whose nature and origins are described in terms too vague to permit rational interpretation. Other accounts characterize them as tools used in religious ceremonies dedicated to deities whose worship predates the arrival of contemporary Dacian religious practices. The most intriguing stories, passed down through families of metalworkers like your own, suggest that these knives were created not for use against external enemies but as instruments for working with materials that no longer exist in the natural world. According to these accounts, ancient Dacian smiths had access to metals and substances that possessed properties unknown to contemporary craftsmen, materials that required specialized tools and techniques for successful manipulation. Your own experiments with recreating such blades have yielded frustrating results. While you can approximate their basic shape and proportions, the distinctive hardness and flexibility of the original metal remains beyond your capabilities. The gold wire work presents even greater challenges. Your finest attempts at wire drawing produce material that appears crude and clumsy when compared to the ancient examples. The ritual interpretation gains credibility when these knives are considered alongside other mysterious objects found throughout Dacian territory. Sacred sites often contain metal artifacts that combine practical and ceremonial elements in ways that suggest their creators saw no fundamental distinction between technological and spiritual activities. The smiths who forged such objects apparently operated within cultural frameworks that integrated metallurgy with religious practice, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Lost forges in the forest. Deep in the mountain forests that surround your settlement, hidden among the dense stands of oak and beech that have grown undisturbed for generations, lie the remains of metalworking facilities whose purpose and origins challenge everything you understand about the history of your craft. These sites, known to only a few hunters and herb gatherers who stumble upon them during their wanderings, contain evidence of smelting and forging activities conducted on a scale that dwarfs anything attempted by contemporary Dacian smiths. The first such site you visited was revealed to you by an old hunter who claimed his grandfather had shown it to him as a boy, with warnings about disturbing the spirits of ancient craftsmen who might still guard their abandoned workshops. Following narrow deer paths through dense undergrowth, you eventually emerged into a clearing where the forest seemed strangely subdued, with fewer birds calling and less insect activity than in the surrounding woods. The most immediately striking feature of the site was a series of stone structures that had obviously been constructed for metalworking but incorporated architectural elements unknown in contemporary practice. The halves were built from fitted stones arranged in complex geometric patterns, with flue systems that channeled smoke and heat through underground passages before releasing them at points hundreds of yards from the actual forges. The engineering required for such construction far exceeds anything you've encountered in modern Dacian settlements. The scale of the operation was equally impressive. Evidence suggests that dozens of forges operated simultaneously at this location, fed by smelting facilities capable of processing ore in quantities that would supply the weapons needs of entire tribal confederations. The arrangement of workshops indicates sophisticated understanding of workflow optimization, with raw materials, intermediate products, and finished goods moving through the facility in patterns designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing unnecessary handling. Most mysterious of all were the traces of materials that had been worked at this site. Standard iron residues were present in expected quantities, along with evidence of bronze, silver, and gold processing that aligned with known Dacian practices. But other metallic residues defied identification, leaving behind traces of elements and compounds that didn't correspond to anything in your experience as a working smith. The tools scattered throughout the site presented similar puzzles. Hammers, tongs, and forming implements were present in the sizes and shapes you would expect, but crafted from materials of unknown composition and displaying levels of sophistication that exceeded anything in contemporary use. Some implements appeared to be designed for working with materials at temperatures far above those achievable with charcoal fires, suggesting access to fuel sources or heating methods that have since been lost. Carbon deposits throughout the site indicated that the forges had burned for extended periods, possibly continuously for years or even decades. The patterns of ash and charcoal accumulation suggested not just intensive use but systematic management of fuel supplies that would have required coordination between the metalworkers and extensive support networks of colliers, suppliers, and transporters. Yet despite clear evidence of large-scale, long-term operations, the sites contain no traces of permanent habitation. No foundations of dwellings, no middens filled with food debris, no burial grounds that would indicate communities of workers living adjacent to their workshops. The smiths who operated these facilities apparently traveled to them from settlements located elsewhere, working in shifts or seasonal campaigns before returning to their home communities. The dating of these sites presents additional mysteries. Analysis of the charcoal deposits and construction techniques suggests they were abandoned centuries before the current generation of Dacian smiths began their training. Yet local oral traditions contain no clear memories of such large-scale metalworking operations, no stories that would explain why they were established, how they were organized, or why they were ultimately abandoned. Dacian metallurgy and modern doubts. As you contemplate these mysteries in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world seems balanced between sleeping and waking, you find yourself questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature and history of your craft. The accumulated evidence, the impossible perfection of ancient bracelets, the puzzling sophistication of ritual blades, the massive scale of abandoned forest forges, suggest that contemporary Dacian metalworking may represent not the culmination of centuries of gradual improvement, but rather a diminished remnant of capabilities that were once far more advanced. This possibility creates profound discomfort for someone who has spent his entire adult life mastering what he believed to be the highest expressions of metallurgical art. If your ancestors possessed knowledge and techniques that current practitioners cannot even comprehend, let alone replicate, then your own expertise becomes suddenly limited and your achievements correspondingly modest. The pride you take in your craftsmanship dims when measured against artifacts that demonstrate capabilities beyond your reach. Yet the evidence continues to accumulate, challenging comfortable assumptions about technological progress and cultural development. Trade contacts with distant regions bring reports of similar phenomena throughout the broader Dacian cultural sphere: mysterious metal objects that exceed contemporary technical capabilities, abandoned metalworking sites that suggest far more sophisticated operations than anything currently active, and oral traditions that hint at knowledge and practices that have been lost or deliberately concealed. The implications extend beyond mere technical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge and its transmission across generations. If advanced metallurgical techniques existed in the past but failed to survive into the present, what factors led to their disappearance? Were they too complex to maintain without institutional support that was subsequently destroyed? Did they depend on resources or materials that became unavailable? Or were they deliberately suppressed by social or political forces that viewed such knowledge as dangerous? Your own family traditions offer partial answers that raise additional questions. Stories passed down through generations of metalworkers describe periods when their craft was practiced in secret, hidden from authorities who viewed skilled smiths as potential threats to established power structures. These accounts suggest that advanced techniques were sometimes lost not through accident or neglect, but through systematic efforts to prevent their practice and transmission. The Roman conquest, which has disrupted so many aspects of Dacian life, may represent only the most recent episode in a longer pattern of cultural destruction and knowledge loss. Previous invasions, internal conflicts, and social upheavals could have systematically eliminated the institutional structures necessary to maintain sophisticated metallurgical practices, leaving behind only fragments and mysteries for subsequent generations to puzzle over. Contemporary Roman metallurgy, despite the empire's reputation for technical sophistication, shows no evidence of capabilities that would explain the mysterious Dacian artifacts. Roman smiths produce excellent weapons and tools using methods that are well understood and widely practiced, but their work lacks the mathematical precision and material perfection evident in the ancient Dacian pieces. If anything, the Romans seem as puzzled by these objects as the Dacians themselves. This suggests that whatever knowledge was responsible for creating the golden bracelets, ritual knives, and massive forest forges was specific to Dacian culture rather than representing a general level of ancient technological development. The loss of this knowledge therefore represents not just technical regression but cultural destruction of a particularly devastating kind, the elimination of intellectual achievements that may have been unique in the ancient world. As you sit in the growing light of dawn, surrounded by the tools and materials of your trade, these reflections create a mixture of humility and determination that will influence your approach to craftsmanship for whatever time remains before Roman rule transforms Dacian society beyond recognition. The mysteries may never be solved, the lost techniques never recovered, but the attempt to understand and preserve what remains of ancient knowledge becomes itself a form of resistance against the forces that seek to reduce all cultural achievement to uniform imperial standards. The bracelet beneath your sleeve grows warm against your skin as the sun rises, its golden spirals catching and reflecting the light in patterns that seem to shift and change even as you watch. In these brief moments before the demands of daily work reclaim your attention, you allow yourself to imagine the master smiths who created such objects, their workshops, their techniques, their understanding of forces and principles that remain mysterious to their descendants. Their legacy lives on not just in the artifacts they left behind, but in the questions they continue to pose about the true scope of human knowledge and the fragility of cultural achievement. Dacian nobles and their decorative armor. The morning light filters through the smoke hole in your workshop roof, illuminating motes of ash and metal dust that dance in the air like tiny spirits celebrating another day of labor. Today brings a commission that fills you with both pride and a certain weary resignation, the creation of ceremonial armor for Dacius, one of the most powerful nobles in your region, a man whose wealth and status are measured not merely in cattle and land, but in the extraordinary metalwork that proclaims his importance to all who see him. Dacius arrived at your workshop before dawn, accompanied by his personal guard and servants carrying leather satchels heavy with precious metals. Unlike the practical warriors for whom you typically create functional weapons and simple armor, Dacius represents a class of Dacian society for whom metalwork serves purposes that extend far beyond mere protection or utility. His commission calls for armor that will function as much as artistic statement and social declaration as defensive equipment. The contrast between your daily existence and that of men like Dacius could hardly be more stark. While you rise each morning to the demanding labor of forge work, breathing smoke and ash, feeling your body gradually worn down by heat and repetitive motion, Dacius spends his days in activities that require no physical exertion beyond mounting his horse or lifting a cup of wine. His hands are soft and uncalloused, his skin unmarked by the small burns and cuts that serve as permanent reminders of your profession. Yet despite these differences in daily experience, you and Dacius share a complex relationship built on mutual dependence and grudging respect. He needs your skills to create the objects that legitimize his social position, while you depend on his patronage for the resources necessary to practice your craft at the highest levels. The finest materials, the most sophisticated tools, and the leisure time required for truly exceptional work all flow from the wealth controlled by nobles like him. The armor Dacius has commissioned represents months of intensive labor and will consume precious materials worth more than most families see in several years. The breastplate alone requires pounds of silver, hammered thin and shaped to follow the contours of his body, then decorated with gold inlay work that depicts scenes from Dacian mythology and his own family history. The complexity of this decorative work demands techniques that push your skills to their absolute limits. Each element of the commission carries symbolic weight that extends far beyond its practical function. The helmet, crafted from iron and decorated with bronze, features spiral patterns that proclaim Dacia's connection to ancient Dacian royal bloodlines. The shoulder guards incorporate protective symbols drawn from religious traditions that predate Roman influence, while the arm guards display his personal achievements in warfare and diplomacy. Every curve, every line, every decorative element has been carefully planned to communicate specific messages about his identity, authority, and place in the social hierarchy. The creation of such elaborate armor requires resources and techniques unavailable to common metalworkers. The silver must be refined to exceptional purity, then worked using specialized tools that you've had to create specifically for this commission. The gold inlay work demands microscopic precision, with individual wire elements thinner than human hair fitted into carefully prepared channels carved into the silver surface. The bronze decorations require casting techniques that produce results smooth enough to accept the detailed engraving that will complete their ornamentation. Working on Dacia's armor provides insights into the lifestyle and values of Dacian nobility that are rarely visible to craftsmen of your social position. The mythological scenes you're depicting in metalwork reflect an oral tradition maintained by professional bards who specialize in preserving stories deemed important by the ruling class. The family history you're immortalizing in silver and gold emphasizes military victories, diplomatic successes, and marriage alliances that strengthen political positions, a version of the past carefully edited to support present claims to authority. The symbolic elements incorporated into the armor's design reveal religious and philosophical beliefs that differ markedly from the practical spirituality observed by working people like yourself. Where your family's religious practices focus on ensuring good harvests, healthy livestock, and protection from immediate dangers, the nobles' beliefs emphasize abstract concepts of destiny, divine favor, and cosmic significance that seem disconnected from daily survival concerns. The burden of perfection. As you work on Dacia's breastplate, shaping the silver to achieve the precise curves he has specified, you become acutely aware of the different standards applied to metalwork created for the nobility versus pieces destined for common use. The margin for error in noble commissions approaches zero. Any flaw, no matter how minor, reflects not just on your technical competence but on your understanding of social hierarchies and appropriate respect for superior status. The pressure creates a form of artistic paralysis that you rarely experience when working on functional pieces for ordinary customers. Each hammer blow must be perfectly controlled, each heating cycle precisely timed, each design element executed with flawless accuracy. The natural variations and subtle irregularities that might be acceptable or even desirable in working weapons become unforgivable defects when they appear in ceremonial armor. This demand for perfection extends beyond mere technical execution to encompass aesthetic choices that reflect the patron's personal preferences and social aspirations. Dacia has strong opinions about every aspect of the armor's appearance, from the exact shade of gold used in the inlay work to the symbolic significance of decorative patterns. He visits your workshop regularly to monitor progress, offering suggestions and modifications that often require you to undo hours of completed work. The noble's involvement in the creative process creates tensions that don't exist when you work independently on standard commissions. Your professional expertise, accumulated through decades of practical experience, must be balanced against his social authority and personal vision for the finished product. When disagreements arise about technical feasibility or aesthetic choices, resolution requires diplomatic skills that have nothing to do with metalworking but everything to do with maintaining the patron relationship essential to your economic survival. The materials provided for noble commissions also present unique challenges. The silver Dacia has supplied is purer than any you've worked with previously, requiring modified techniques and tools adapted to its specific properties. The gold is similarly refined, with characteristics that demand adjustments to standard inlay procedures. Even the iron used for structural elements has been specially selected and prepared, free from the minor impurities that are routine in commercial metal supplies. Working with such exceptional materials is simultaneously inspiring and nerve-wracking. The potential for creating something truly extraordinary exists alongside the catastrophic consequences of making irreversible mistakes. A poorly placed hammer blow, an incorrectly timed heating cycle, or a momentary lapse in concentration could destroy materials worth more than your workshop and tools combined, effectively ending your career and ruining your family's economic prospects. The time required for noble commissions also creates disruptions to your normal working routine. Months devoted to a single elaborate piece mean that orders from ordinary customers must be delayed or declined, potentially damaging long-term relationships with the community members who provide the bulk of your regular income. The economic benefits of noble patronage must be weighed against the social costs of neglecting your traditional customer base. The weight of social distance. The cultural gap between your world and that of the nobility becomes increasingly apparent as work on the armor progresses. Dacia's casual references to places you've never seen, people you've never met, and concepts you've never encountered reveal the extent to which social position shapes not just material circumstances but entire ways of understanding reality. His stories of diplomatic missions to Roman territories describe interactions with imperial officials as routine business transactions, while for you, the mere prospect of encountering Roman authority represents potential disaster. He speaks of traveling to distant Dacian settlements as easily as you might discuss visiting the next village, with access to guides, provisions, and safe passage that reflect privileges unavailable to common craftsmen. The foods he mentions consuming, the entertainments he describes enjoying, and the possessions he considers normal all exist in a realm of experience completely foreign to your daily life. Wine imported from Greek islands, silk cloth from distant eastern lands, and jewelry crafted by smiths whose reputations extend across the known world represent luxuries so far beyond your reach that they might as well exist in stories rather than reality. Yet despite these vast differences in lifestyle and resources, Dacia demonstrates genuine appreciation for your craftsmanship and shows respect for the knowledge and skills that only years of dedicated practice can develop. His questions about techniques reveal curiosity about the creative process, while his suggestions for design modifications often display sophisticated understanding of metallurgical principles. This combination of social distance and professional respect creates a complex dynamic that characterizes many interactions between skilled craftsmen and noble patrons. You remain acutely aware of the hierarchical differences that govern your relationship, but within the specific context of metalworking, your expertise grants you a form of authority that temporarily equalizes the interaction. The conversations that develop during his workshop visits provide glimpses into political and military developments that rarely reach your community through normal channels. Dacia's casual comments about troop movements, diplomatic negotiations, and strategic planning offer insights into the larger forces shaping Dacian society's future, information that proves both fascinating and troubling as you contemplate its implications for your own family's prospects. Symbols of a dying world. As the armor nears completion, its elaborate decorations and symbolic elements begin to seem less like celebrations of Dacian culture and more like desperate attempts to preserve traditions that are rapidly becoming obsolete. The mythological scenes worked into the silver tell stories of heroes who defeated enemies and overcame challenges through individual courage and divine favor, but the contemporary reality involves facing Roman legions whose victories depend on disciplined organization and superior technology rather than personal heroism. The family genealogies traced in gold wire emphasize bloodlines connecting Dacias to legendary kings and ancient noble houses, but these connections provide no practical advantages in negotiations with Roman administrators who care nothing for Dacian aristocratic traditions. The protective symbols drawn from traditional religious practices may offer psychological comfort, but they cannot deflect javelin thrusts or turn aside sword blades wielded by professional soldiers. Working on the armor becomes increasingly melancholy as you recognize that you may be creating not just ceremonial regalia but a kind of funeral monument to a way of life that will not survive the changes already reshaping Dacian society. The skills you've employed, the materials you've worked with, and the cultural knowledge you've incorporated into the design all represent traditions that may have no place in whatever political arrangement emerges from the current conflicts. The irony is not lost on you that some of your finest work is being devoted to creating objects that serve primarily to maintain social distinctions that Roman conquest will ultimately render meaningless. Dacia's elaborate armor will not save him from the leveling effects of imperial administration, which recognizes only categories of citizenship, taxation, and administrative convenience rather than traditional aristocratic privileges based on blood, achievement, or cultural authority. Yet the Commission also represents an assertion of cultural continuity in the face of overwhelming pressures toward assimilation and accommodation. By investing in traditional metalwork of exceptional quality, Dacian is making a statement about the continuing value of Dacian artistic traditions and the importance of maintaining connections to ancestral practices even as external circumstances force adaptation in other areas of life. The armor, when completed, will function as both personal regalia and cultural artifact, preserving in metal form knowledge and traditions that may otherwise be lost as Roman influence transforms Dacian society. Future generations, whether they remain culturally Dacian or become thoroughly Romanized, will be able to examine the breastplate's decorations and understand something about the values, beliefs, and artistic capabilities of their ancestors. The final polish. The last stages of work on Dacia's armor involve polishing and finishing procedures that transform functional metalwork into objects of extraordinary beauty. The silver surfaces are brought to a mirror finish that reflects light with startling brilliance, while the gold inlay work gleams with warm richness that seems to glow within a fire. The bronze decorations are treated with compounds that will preserve their color and prevent tarnishing, ensuring that the armor's appearance will remain impressive for years to come. Each piece is carefully fitted and adjusted to ensure perfect alignment and comfortable wear, despite the armor's primarily ceremonial function. The weight distribution is balanced to allow extended wearing without excessive fatigue, while the joint articulation permits reasonable freedom of movement for ritual activities and formal appearances. Even as decorative regalia, the armor must function effectively as clothing suitable for the demanding physical activities that characterize noble social obligations. The final assembly reveals the full impact of months of intensive labor. The completed armor transforms Dacian from an impressive but ultimately ordinary-looking man into a figure of almost supernatural authority and presence. The interplay of different metals creates visual effects that shift and change as he moves, while the symbolic decorations proclaim his status and achievements to anyone familiar with Dacian cultural traditions. Standing in your workshop, surrounded by the tools and materials of your trade, you experience a complex mixture of pride and sadness as you contemplate the finished commission. The armor represents some of your finest work, demonstrating mastery of techniques and materials that few craftsmen ever have the opportunity to explore. Yet it also marks the end of an era in your professional life, quite possibly the last opportunity to create metalwork of such ambition and cultural significance. As Dacian examines the completed pieces, his expression reveals satisfaction that goes beyond mere approval of craftsmanship to encompass recognition of the armor's success as both artistic achievement and social statement. His words of praise acknowledge not just your technical skills but your understanding of the cultural meanings embedded in the work, confirming that the commission has fulfilled its intended purposes as both personal regalia and cultural preservation. The transaction that concludes the commission involves not just payment for services rendered but the establishment of ongoing relationships that may prove valuable in whatever uncertain future awaits Dacian society. Dacia's satisfaction with your work creates possibilities for additional commissions, recommendations to other noble patrons, and perhaps most importantly, protection and support if political circumstances require craftsmen to seek powerful allies for survival. As evening shadows lengthen across your workshop and the day's work comes to an end, you clean and organize your tools while reflecting on the strange ironies that have characterized this commission. You have spent months creating armor for a nobleman whose authority may soon become meaningless, using skills that may have no place in a Romanized future, working with materials more precious than anything you're likely to see again, all in service of preserving cultural traditions that may not survive the next decade. Yet the work itself has been deeply satisfying, pushing your abilities to their limits and resulting in objects of genuine beauty and cultural significance. Whatever the future holds for Dacian society, the armor will endure as testimony to the sophistication and artistry that characterized your people's metalworking traditions. In creating it, you have participated in the ancient human impulse to preserve meaning and beauty against the forces of change and destruction that threaten to sweep away everything familiar and valued. The forge fire dies to glowing coals as darkness settles over the mountain valleys, and in the growing quiet, you allow yourself to hope that somewhere in the uncertain times ahead, there will still be a place for the skills and knowledge that have defined your life's work. As our journey through the smoky, demanding world of the Dacian metalworker draws to a close, let yourself settle deeper into the comfort of your bed, feeling the softness that surrounds you, the warmth that protects you, the safety that enfolds you. You have walked alongside Zamalxis through his days of endless labor, felt the heat of his forge, heard the rhythm of his hammer, and understood the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders as his world faced transformation and eventual conquest. Think now of the vast gulf that separates your comfortable modern existence from the harsh realities of ancient craftsmanship. Where Zamalxis woke each morning to the demands of fire and metal, you wake to conveniences and comforts that would seem miraculous to someone from his time. Where he breathed smoke and ash, you breathed clean air. Where he worked with tools that were extensions of his own body, shaped by years of use and wear, you are surrounded by technologies that would be incomprehensible to an ancient smith. The mysteries we explored, those golden bracelets with their impossible perfection, the massive forest forges abandoned to time and growth, the ritual knives that blur the line between weapon and sacred implement, remind us that human knowledge and capability do not always progress in straight lines. Sometimes civilizations achieve heights that subsequent generations cannot match or even understand. Sometimes wisdom is lost, techniques forgotten, and entire ways of life vanish into the mists of time. Zamarxes and his fellow craftsmen represented the end of something precious and irreplaceable, a tradition of metalworking that combined technical excellence with cultural meaning, individual artistry with community service, practical skill with spiritual significance. Their forges fell silent not because their knowledge was obsolete, but because the world changed around them in ways that made their particular forms of excellence no longer sustainable. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind release the tensions and concerns of your own time, just as Zamarxes finally laid down his hammer and allowed his fire to die to cooling embers. The struggles he faced, against material constraints, social pressures, political upheaval, and ultimately the overwhelming force of imperial conquest, belong to a distant past that cannot touch you here in your safe, comfortable present. Feel the weight of your blankets as Zamarxes felt the weight of his leather apron, but where his weight spoke of labor and hardship, yours speaks of comfort and rest. Feel the warmth around you as he felt the warmth of his forge, but where his heat was demanding and oppressive, yours is gentle and nurturing. Let the rhythm of your breathing replace the rhythm of his hammer, steady and calm, carrying you deeper into the peaceful darkness of sleep. The smoke has cleared, the hammers have fallen silent, and the ancient forges have cooled forever. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world rests between sleeping and waking, perhaps you can still hear the distant echo of metal striking metal, the whisper of bellows breathing life into fire, and the voices of craftsmen who transformed raw earth into objects of beauty, utility, and meaning. Sleep now, in the comfort and safety that their struggles helped to create, and let their stories fade into the peaceful darkness that welcomes all who have labored long and deserve their rest. What if your entire life was spent underground, your name erased, your body chained, and your labor enriching an empire that conquered your homeland? Tonight, we descend into that forgotten world. In the cold shadows of Roman Dacia, tens of thousands lived and died as slaves. No glory, no freedom, just endless days of stone, hunger, and silence. But in their quiet suffering lived defiance, memory, and humanity. This is not heroic history. It's the truth beneath it. So lie back, breathe deep, and listen closely to the story of those who built Rome's frontier, but never escaped its grip. Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we venture into the ancient world of Roman Dacia, to a time when the mountains of what we now call Romania echoed with the sound of pickaxes and the weight of chains. Settle yourself comfortably as we explore a life that existed in shadow and silence, the existence of a Dacian slave under Roman rule. This is not a tale of grand battles or heroic deeds, but rather the steady rhythm of survival, the daily persistence of the human spirit even in the darkest circumstances. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let your mind drift back nearly 2,000 years, to a world where freedom was a distant memory and each day began and ended with the metallic whisper of shackles. Tonight, we walk in the footsteps of those whose names were erased from history, whose stories were written not in chronicles but in the wear patterns of stone floors and the marks left by countless hands on quarry walls. Let the gentle cadence of this narrative carry you through the ages, as we uncover what life was truly like for those who built an empire with their labor, yet never shared in its glory. The first sound each morning was not the crow of a rooster or the gentle stirring of a peaceful household. Instead, it was the deliberate clank of iron against iron as the night guard moved through the slave quarters, his keys jangling a harsh melody that meant the beginning of another day of toil. Imagine yourself lying on a thin straw pallet, your body still heavy with the exhaustion of yesterday's labor. The walls around you are rough-hewn stone, damp with the mountain mist that seeps through every crack and crevice. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, damp earth, and the lingering smoke from the small fires that provided meager warmth through the night. You share this cramped space with perhaps 20 other souls, men, women, and children who were once free Dacians, who once knew the feeling of wolf pelt cloaks and the taste of honey mead in their own halls. Now you are property of Rome, marked with the brand that burns eternally into memory, a constant reminder of your transformed status. The guard's footsteps approach your sleeping area. His voice cuts through the pre-dawn darkness, harsh Latin syllables that you've learned to understand through repetition and necessity. Sergeant. Rise. The command is always the same, delivered with the casual authority of someone who has never questioned his right to command others. Your fellow slaves begin to stir around you. There is no rushing, no sudden movements. Such displays of energy were beaten out of the survivors long ago. Instead, there is the careful, measured rising of people who know that every movement must be calculated to preserve what little strength remains for the day ahead. The iron shackles that bind your ankles have worn smooth grooves in your skin over the months or years of your captivity. You've learned to walk with the particular shuffling gait that prevents the metal from cutting too deeply, though the raw patches never quite heal. The chains are long enough to allow work but short enough to prevent any thought of flight. As you rise, the familiar ache settles into your bones, the deep, persistent pain that comes from sleeping on stone and working with tools too heavy for comfort. Your hands, once skilled at crafting silver jewelry or weaving intricate patterns, are now calloused beyond recognition, permanently stained with the dust of whatever material you're forced to excavate or construct. The morning meal, if it can be called such, consists of a thin gruel made from barley and water, sometimes supplemented with scraps of bread so hard it must be soaked before it can be chewed. You eat quickly, not from hunger alone but from the knowledge that lingering over food is a luxury you cannot afford. The guards grow impatient, and an impatient guard is a dangerous thing. Around you, conversations occur in whispered Dacian, the language of your birth that you're forbidden to speak loudly. These quiet exchanges are the lifeline that connects you to who you once were, fragments of news about family members sold to other masters, speculation about the changing seasons in the homeland you may never see again, small prayers to Zalmoxis whispered so quietly they can barely be heard. The children in your group present a particularly heartbreaking sight. Those born into slavery know no other life, their bright eyes already learning the downcast expression that keeps them safe from too much attention. The older children, captured in raids, still sometimes cry for mothers who may be working in households hundreds of miles away, or who may no longer exist at all. As dawn light begins to filter through the narrow windows of your quarters, the day's work assignments are announced. Some of you will be sent to the stone quarries that ring the Roman settlements, where the endless demand for building material means long days of breaking rock under the mountain sun. Others will be directed to the construction sites where those stones are assembled into roads, aqueducts, and the grand buildings that showcase Roman engineering prowess. The lucky few might be assigned to household duties, cleaning, cooking, or tending to the personal needs of Roman families. This work is less physically demanding but comes with its own dangers, as proximity to Roman citizens means greater scrutiny and the constant possibility of arbitrary punishment for perceived slights or mistakes. Your own assignment today is to the silver mines that honeycomb the mountains around Alburnus Maya. The irony is not lost on you. These are the same mountains where your people once freely extracted precious metals to create the beautiful artifacts that adorn Dacian nobles. Now you extract that same silver to fill Roman coffers, your labor enriching the very empire that destroyed your homeland. The walk to the mine entrance takes nearly an hour, a shuffling procession of shackled figures moving through the morning mist. Roman guards on horseback flank the group, their presence a constant reminder that any attempt to flee would result in swift and brutal consequences. The landscape you passed through was once familiar, but Roman occupation has transformed it. Forests cleared for timber, streams diverted for mining operations, and the sacred groves of your ancestors reduced to stumps. The mine entrance looms before you like the mouth of some ancient beast. The wooden supports frame an opening that disappears into impenetrable darkness, and the air that flows from its depths carries the metallic scent of ore and the mustiness of earth that has never seen sunlight. This will be your world for the next 12 hours, a realm of hammer blows and aching backs, of dust that fills your lungs and the constant fear of cave-ins. Your tools are simple but brutally effective, an iron pick worn smooth by countless hands, a wooden bucket for hauling ore, and a small oil lamp that provides just enough light to see the immediate work area. The pick is heavy, designed for maximum impact rather than comfort, and after hours of use it will leave your hands cramped and bleeding despite the thick calluses that have developed over time. Inside the mine, the temperature is constant, cool enough to prevent overheating but warm enough that the combination of exertion and poor ventilation creates a stifling atmosphere. The walls weep moisture constantly, creating treacherous footing on the rough-hewn pathways that connect the various excavation sites. The sound of your work echoes strangely in the confined space, creating a rhythm that becomes almost hypnotic, the strike of metal on stone, the scrape of ore being gathered, the shuffle of feet on uneven ground. The Romans have divided the mine into sections, each overseen by a particular guard who knows exactly how much or should be extracted by each worker in a given period. Fall short of your quota, and evening brings reduced rations and the possibility of punishment. Exceed it, and you earn nothing. There are no rewards for exceptional effort, only the absence of penalties. As you work, your mind often drifts to memories of your former life. Perhaps you remember the feeling of morning sun on your face as you tended sheep in mountain pastures, or the satisfaction of completing a piece of metalwork that would be traded with distant tribes. These memories are both blessing and curse. They provide escape from the immediate reality of your situation, but they also serve as cruel reminders of everything that has been lost. The other slaves working near you move with the same careful efficiency born of experience and necessity. Conversation is minimal. The echoing acoustics of the mine mean that guards can overhear everything, and speaking in Dacian is strictly forbidden in work areas. Instead, communication happens through glances, subtle gestures, and the occasional whispered warning about loose rocks or guard movements. Midday brings a brief respite when you're allowed to rest and consume a small portion of bread and watered wine. You sit in the darkness of the mine tunnel, your back against the damp stone wall, feeling the blessed relief of muscles no longer required to lift and strike. The silence during these breaks is profound, 20 or 30 people resting in complete quiet, conserving energy for the afternoon's labor. The afternoon shift is always the hardest. Your body, already pushed to its limits during the morning, must somehow find the strength to continue. The oil in your lamp burns lower, making the work area dimmer and more dangerous. Your pick strikes become less precise, your movements more labored, and the constant ache in your back intensifies with every swing. As evening approaches and the distant sound of horns signals the end of the workday, you begin the slow process of gathering your tools and preparing for the journey back to the slave quarters. Your bucket, filled with the day's or extraction, must be hauled to the weighing station where a Roman overseer will determine whether your efforts were sufficient. The walk back to your quarters is a study in exhaustion. Your shackles, which felt merely burdensome in the morning, now seem to weigh as much as the tools you carry. Your fellow slaves move like shadows in the gathering dusk, their faces marked with the particular weariness that comes from work that serves only to enrich others. Evening brings the final meal of the day, another portion of thin gruel, perhaps supplemented with vegetables if the day's work quotas were met. You eat slowly, partly from exhaustion and partly from the knowledge that this small sustenance must somehow provide energy for tomorrow's identical routine. As darkness settles over the Roman settlement, you return to your straw pallet in the slave quarters. The iron shackles are checked one final time by the guards, ensuring that sleep will bring no thoughts of escape. Around you, your fellow captives settle into the familiar positions that provide the most comfort on the hard stone floor. In the darkness before sleep claims you, you might whisper a prayer to the gods of your ancestors, asking not for rescue, such hopes died long ago, but simply for the strength to endure another day. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same hardships, the same grinding repetition that defines slave life under Roman rule. The last sound you hear before sleep is often the quiet sobbing of someone newly captured, someone still adjusting to the reality that this existence, this reduction of human dignity to mere labor value, is now their permanent condition. You remember your own first nights, the disbelief and rage that eventually gave way to the numb acceptance necessary for survival. And so another day ends in the life of a Dacian slave, measured not in achievements or joys, but in the simple fact of continued existence under circumstances designed to break both body and spirit. Yet even here, in this darkest chapter of human experience, the essential spark of humanity persists, in whispered conversations, in shared glances of understanding, in the quiet determination to see another sunrise, whatever it might bring. The transition from individual suffering to collective action rarely happens suddenly in the world of slavery. Instead, it grows slowly, like water seeping through stone, gathering force until it finds a crack wide enough to exploit. Such was the case in the silver mines of Alburnus Maia during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, when a slave whose Roman name was recorded as Titus, though his Dacian birth name has been lost to history, began to plant the seeds of what would become one of the most significant slave uprisings in Roman Dacia. Imagine yourself now as a witness to this gradual awakening of resistance, watching as desperation slowly transforms into something approaching hope. Titus was not remarkable in appearance, middle-aged, of average height, with the permanent stoop that came from years of working in low mine tunnels. His hands were scarred from countless accidents with picks and sharp stones, and his left shoulder bore the distinctive brand that marked him as property of the imperial mining operation. What set Titus apart was not his physical presence but his memory. Unlike many slaves who had been captured as children and had only fragmentary recollections of free life, Titus had been a metalworker in his former existence, a craftsman who had understood not just the labor of extraction but the entire process of transforming raw ore into finished goods. This knowledge gave him a unique perspective on the true value of their daily toil and the vast wealth being extracted from Dacian soil. The rebellion began not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with quiet conversations during the brief rest periods in the depths of the mines. Titus would speak softly to fellow slaves about the old ways, about the time when these very mountains had provided prosperity for Dacian communities rather than Roman treasuries. His words carried weight because they came from experience rather than mere longing. "You see how they measure our ore," he would whisper as overseers counted the day's extraction. "A single bucket of what we dig could feed a family for months, yet we receive barely enough growl to keep us working." These observations, simple and undeniable, began to create a shared awareness among the slave population that their suffering served a specific purpose beyond mere cruelty. The growing sense of unity among the slaves did not go unnoticed by the Roman guards, but initially it was dismissed as the natural bonding that occurred among people sharing hardship. The Romans had dealt with slave populations for centuries and were confident in their ability to prevent organized resistance through a combination of surveillance, punishment, and the strategic mixing of slaves from different regions to prevent linguistic unity. However, the administrators had underestimated both the linguistic adaptability of their captives and the power of shared suffering to transcend cultural differences. Titus spoke not only his native Dacian but also fragments of Thracian, Sarmatian, and even some Germanic dialects picked up during his years of captivity. This allowed him to communicate with slaves from various conquered territories, creating networks of understanding that crossed ethnic boundaries. The first concrete step toward rebellion came during the winter months, when shorter days meant longer periods of darkness in the slave quarters. Titus began organizing what appeared to be innocent evening gatherings where slaves would share stories from their homelands. These sessions served multiple purposes. They maintained morale by preserving cultural memories, they allowed for the discreet planning of resistance activities, and they provided cover for the gradual accumulation of resources. The resources in question were simple but crucial: extra food saved from daily rations, pieces of metal that could serve as crude weapons, knowledge of guard routines and mine layouts, and most importantly, information about the broader Roman presence in the region. Titus had correctly reasoned that any successful uprising would need to extend beyond the confines of the mining operation to have any chance of long-term success. The plan that gradually emerged was both ambitious and desperate. The slaves would coordinate their efforts to seize control of the mine during a shift change, when guards were at their most vulnerable. They would then use their knowledge of the mountain terrain to establish defensive positions while sending messengers to other slave populations throughout Roman Dacia, hoping to spark a general uprising that would overwhelm the Roman military presence. The timing was chosen to coincide with the spring festival of Samizagitusa, when many Roman officials would be distracted by ceremonial duties and the arrival of new administrative personnel from Rome. This seasonal transition would also provide better weather for movement through the mountains and the possibility of living off the land while organizing broader resistance. As spring approached, the atmosphere in the mines became increasingly tense. Slaves who had been included in the planning moved with barely contained nervous energy, while those who remained unaware sensed that something significant was developing. The Roman guards, experienced in reading the moods of their charges, began to increase their vigilance without understanding exactly what they were watching for. The rebellion was scheduled to begin at dawn on the third day of the spring month, when the night shift would be ending and the day workers would be gathering for their morning assignments. Titus had calculated that this moment of transition would provide approximately 30 minutes when the slave population would be at its highest concentration while guard attention was divided between ending and beginning shift responsibilities. The plan began to unravel 3 days before the scheduled uprising, when a slave named Marcus, a Thracian who had been captured during a border raid, approached the mine superintendent with information about the developing conspiracy. The motivations behind this betrayal remain unclear from the historical record, though it's possible that Marcus had been promised freedom or simply hoped to earn better treatment through cooperation with the authorities. The Roman response was swift and merciless. Rather than attempting to arrest only the ringleaders, the mine administrators decided to make an example that would prevent any future attempts at organized resistance. Before dawn on the day originally chosen for the rebellion, Roman soldiers surrounded the slave quarters and began a systematic process of interrogation and punishment. Titus was identified immediately, of course, and his fate was sealed from the moment of his capture. However, the Romans were interested in more than simple execution. They wanted to demonstrate the futility of resistance and ensure that the lesson would be remembered by every slave who witnessed the consequences. The punishment was designed to be both physically devastating and psychologically crushing. The executions took place in the central courtyard of the mining complex, where all slaves were forced to witness the proceedings. Titus and 12 other identified leaders were crucified on wooden crosses that had been specially constructed for the occasion. The process was deliberately slow, designed to maximize both suffering and the duration of the spectacle. But the Roman punishment extended beyond the ringleaders. Every slave who had been identified as a participant or supporter of the rebellion was subjected to severe flogging, branded with additional marks to identify them as dangerous, and assigned to the most hazardous work details in the deepest and most unstable sections of the mine. These assignments were essentially death sentences carried out over months rather than hours. Perhaps most cruelly, the families of the conspirators, wives, children, and elderly parents who had played no role in the rebellion, were sold to masters in distant provinces, ensuring that the punishment would extend across generations and that any survivors would live with the knowledge that their actions had brought suffering to innocent loved ones. The psychological impact of the failed rebellion was profound and lasting. The sense of possibility that had been growing among the slave population was replaced by a resigned despair that was perhaps more crushing than their original captivity had been. Hope, once lost, proved far more difficult to recover than it had been to build in the first place. In the years following the uprising, the mining operation continued with increased security measures and more sophisticated surveillance of the slave population. Guard rotations were randomized to prevent slaves from learning predictable patterns, informants were recruited from among the captive population with promises of minor privileges, and any gathering of more than 3 slaves was automatically treated as suspicious activity. The memory of Titus and his fellow conspirators lived on in whispered stories, but these tales served more as warnings than as inspiration. Parents told their children about the rebellion not to encourage resistance but to emphasize the importance of survival and the terrible consequences that followed any challenge to Roman authority. The historical records of this event are fragmentary, preserved mainly in administrative documents that focus on the Roman response rather than the experiences of the slaves themselves. We know that the rebellion occurred, that it was betrayed before it could begin, and that the punishment was severe enough to serve as a deterrent for decades afterward. But the personal stories, the individual motivations, and the human cost of both the rebellion and its suppression can only be reconstructed through careful interpretation of the limited evidence that survives. What emerges from this tragic episode is a portrait of people pushed to their absolute limits, who found the courage to risk everything for the possibility of freedom, even when they understood that failure would bring consequences far worse than their current suffering. Their attempt failed, but it represents one of the few moments when enslaved Dacians found the strength to assert their humanity in the face of a system designed to reduce them to mere tools of labor. The gentle slope of a hillside overlooking the ancient settlement of Apulum holds secrets that archaeologists are still working to understand. Here, scattered among the more elaborate tombstones of Roman citizens and freedmen, lie hundreds of simple stone markers, rough-hewn rectangles of local limestone, weathered by centuries of mountain weather, bearing no inscriptions, no names, no dates to mark the lives they commemorate. These anonymous graves represent one of the most haunting archaeological mysteries of Roman Dacia, the burial places of slaves whose existence was considered so insignificant that even death could not grant them the dignity of a recorded name. Yet within this silence lies a story that speaks volumes about the lives, beliefs, and quiet acts of resistance that characterized the enslaved population of this frontier province. Imagine yourself walking among these weathered stones on a misty morning, when the dew still clings to the rough surfaces and the distant mountains emerge slowly from the pre-dawn darkness. Each marker represents not just a death, but a life, someone who woke each morning in shackles, who knew hunger and exhaustion as constant companions, who found ways to maintain their humanity despite a system designed to strip it away. The positioning of these graves follows patterns that become apparent only when viewed from above, arrangements that suggest careful planning despite the apparent simplicity of the individual markers. Groups of stones are clustered in ways that seem to reflect family relationships or shared origins, with smaller markers, presumably marking the graves of children, often placed in protective arrangements surrounded by larger stones. Dr. Elena Popescu, whose excavations in the 1990s first brought serious archaeological attention to this site, discovered that many of these unmarked graves contained burial goods that told stories the stone markers could not. Small iron amulets shaped like wolves, traditional Dacian pottery hidden beneath Roman-style grave offerings, and coins placed over the eyes according to both Roman and pre-Roman customs, these finds revealed a complex blend of cultural practices that persisted even in death. The wolf amulets are particularly significant, as they represent direct connections to Dacian religious traditions that the Romans had attempted to suppress. The wolf was sacred to the Dacian god Zalmoxis, and these small iron tokens suggest that enslaved Dacians found ways to honor their ancestral beliefs even under the watchful eyes of Roman administrators. The fact that families risked punishment to bury these forbidden symbols with their dead speaks to the enduring power of spiritual identity. Some graves contained more mysterious artifacts, small lead tablets inscribed with what appear to be curse formulations, written in a mixture of Latin and Dacian script. These depictions, as they are known to scholars, were typically used to call upon supernatural forces to right wrongs or punish enemies. The tablets found in slave graves often invoke protection for the deceased and retribution against unnamed oppressors, suggesting that even in death, the enslaved maintained hopes for cosmic justice. The pottery fragments recovered from these sites tell their own story of cultural persistence and adaptation. While the forms often follow Roman patterns, practical considerations, as slaves would have had access primarily to Roman-style workshops, the decorative elements frequently incorporate traditional Dacian motifs. Spiral patterns that echo the sacred geometry found in pre-conquest Dacian art appear on simple cooking vessels, while wolf and serpent designs are subtly worked into the handles of drinking cups. Perhaps most intriguingly, several graves have yielded evidence of what archaeologists term hidden names, personal identifiers that were concealed within the burial goods rather than displayed on the grave markers themselves. Small bronze discs, often hidden inside pottery vessels, bear inscriptions in the Old Dacian script that appears to record not only names but also places of origin and family lineages. One such disc, discovered in 2003, bears the inscription Diopanius son of Commosicus of the Apuli tribe, taken in the third year of Trajan's conquest. This simple text, hidden from Roman eyes but preserved for eternity, represents both an act of remembrance and a quiet form of resistance, a refusal to let Roman slavery erase Dacian identity completely. The children's graves present some of the most emotionally challenging aspects of this archaeological record. Small skeletal remains show evidence of nutritional deficiencies and premature bone wear that speaks to lives of hard labor begun at impossibly young ages. Yet these same graves often contain the most elaborate hidden burial goods, carved wooden toys that echo traditional Dacian craftsmanship, small bronze mirrors that suggest these children were loved and valued despite their legal status as property. Analysis of the skeletal remains from these unmarked graves has provided sobering insights into the physical realities of slave life in Roman Dacia. The average life expectancy appears to have been significantly lower than that of the free population, with many individuals showing evidence of injuries consistent with mining accidents, repetitive stress injuries from manual labor, and nutritional deficiencies that suggest chronic underfeeding. The spine compression found in many adult skeletons tells the story of lives spent carrying heavy loads and working in cramped conditions. Healed bone fractures suggest that medical care, while basic, was provided, presumably because injured slaves represented damaged property that needed to be repaired rather than discarded. The pattern of healing, however, often shows signs of improper setting, resulting in permanent disabilities that would have made daily labor even more challenging. Some graves contain evidence of more violent deaths, skeletal trauma consistent with beatings or execution-style killings. These remains are often found in isolated sections of the burial ground, suggesting that even in death, those who had been punished for resistance or escape attempts were segregated from the general slave population. The seasonal patterns of death, reconstructed through careful analysis of soil layers and burial positioning, reveal the brutal rhythm of slave mortality in Roman Dacia. Deaths peaked during the winter months, when inadequate shelter and nutrition combined with continued labor demands proved fatal for the weakest members of the enslaved population. Spring months show evidence of epidemic diseases, likely spread through the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of slave housing. Yet within this grim archaeological record, there are also signs of community care and mutual support that speak to the preservation of human compassion even under the most dehumanizing circumstances. Elderly individuals who would have been unable to meet work quotas show evidence of having lived years beyond their productive capacity, suggesting that fellow slaves found ways to protect and provide for those who could no longer protect themselves. The mystery deepens when we consider the logistics of these burials. Roman law required that slave deaths be reported to administrative authorities, yet the existence of these hidden burial grounds suggests that at least some deaths went unreported. This implies either the cooperation of sympathetic Romans, perhaps freedmen who remembered their own enslavement, or a level of organization among the slave population that allowed for secret burial practices. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed that the known burial sites represent only a fraction of what appears to be a much larger necropolis. Preliminary estimates suggest that hundreds more unmarked graves may lie beneath the soil, representing a hidden population whose existence has been almost entirely erased from the historical record. The religious practices evidenced in these graves reveal a fascinating syncretism between Dacian, Roman, and other cultural traditions. Burial orientations follow both Roman customs, with heads pointing west, and older Dacian practices that align the deceased with significant astronomical events. Some graves show evidence of periodic visitation and ritual maintenance, suggesting that family members or fellow slaves continued to honor the dead despite the risks involved in maintaining such practices. The absence of Christian symbolism in these early graves is notable, as it suggests that the new religion had not yet penetrated deeply into the slave population of Roman Dacia. This would change in later centuries, but during the height of the mining operations, the enslaved population appears to have maintained their traditional spiritual practices despite official Roman disapproval. Carbon dating of organic materials from these sites has revealed that many of the graves date to the period immediately following major military campaigns in Dacia, confirming historical accounts of large-scale enslavement following Roman victories. The clustering of burials from these periods tells the tragic story of populations that struggled to survive the transition from freedom to bondage. As you stand among these silent witnesses to forgotten lives, consider the courage it took for fellow slaves to risk punishment in order to provide proper burial for their dead. Each hidden amulet, each secret inscription, each carefully arranged grave good represents an act of love and remembrance that defied the Roman attempt to reduce human beings to mere economic units. The unmarked graves of Roman Dacia stand as monuments to both suffering and endurance, reminding us that even when official history forgets entire populations, the archaeological record preserves evidence of lives lived with dignity despite circumstances designed to destroy that very dignity. In their anonymity, these graves speak louder than the elaborate monuments of their oppressors, testifying to the enduring power of human connection and the universal desire to be remembered by those we leave behind. The villa of Marcus Cornelius Fronto rises from the hillside like a marble dream made manifest, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun while terraced gardens cascade down the slope toward the valley below. From the slaves' quarters hidden behind service buildings, the sound of hammer on chisel carries on the mountain air, a constant rhythm that speaks of construction that never ends, embellishment that never ceases, and wealth that flows as steadily as the mountain streams. Imagine yourself now observing this world from both perspectives, the sunlit splendor of Roman luxury and the shadowed reality of the labor that makes such luxury possible. The contrast is not merely visual but represents a fundamental divide between two entirely different experiences of existence in Roman Dacia, separated by walls both literal and invisible. Marcus Cornelius Fronto arrived in Dacia as a young administrator during the reign of Hadrian, carrying with him the ambitions of a minor patrician family and the connections necessary to secure a profitable posting in the provinces. His rise to wealth was swift and methodical, built upon his appointment as supervisor of mining operations in the Alburnus Maya region and his shrewd investment in land grants that came with established slave populations. The villa that bears his name today, though the structure has long since crumbled to foundation stones and scattered marble fragments, was constructed entirely by the hands of enslaved Dacians whose names appear nowhere in the elaborate dedicatory inscriptions that once adorned its walls. The irony is profound. Men and women who had once built homes for themselves in the traditional Dacian style, using local stone and timber in harmony with the mountain landscape, were now forced to construct a Roman fantasy that imposed Mediterranean architectural dreams upon Carpathian reality. The construction process itself reveals the vast gulf between Roman aspirations and slave experiences. While Fronto planned his villa from the comfort of his temporary quarters, sketching layouts that would showcase his status and provide appropriate settings for entertaining fellow Romans, the actual builders worked through mountain winters with inadequate shelter and clothing, their hands cracking from cold as they shaped imported marble that cost more than their lives were valued. The villa's design followed classical Roman patterns, with modifications necessary for the Dacian climate and available materials. The central atrium featured a shallow pool fed by an ingenious aqueduct system that channeled mountain spring water through hidden channels beneath the marble floors. The engineering required for this system was considerable, demanding precisely calculated gradients and expertly fitted stone conduits that would function reliably despite winter freezing. The slaves who built this system possessed the technical knowledge necessary for such work, but their expertise had been acquired through generations of Dacian engineering traditions rather than Roman training. The mountains of Dacia had always required sophisticated water management, and the pre-conquest population had developed techniques for channeling streams, creating drainage systems, and preventing frost damage that proved invaluable to their Roman masters. Yet this expertise went entirely unacknowledged in the Roman accounts of the villa's construction. Fronto's letters to friends in Rome describe the project as a triumph of Roman engineering brought to a barbarous land, making no mention of the indigenous knowledge that made the villa's most impressive features possible. The slaves who designed and built the water systems were credited no more than the stones they carved or the timber they shaped. The villa's interior spaces tell their own story of luxury built upon suffering. The dining room, or triclinium, featured elaborate mosaic floors depicting scenes from Roman mythology: Neptune rising from the sea, Diana hunting in moonlit forests, Mars receiving the honors of victory. These mosaics were created by skilled artisans who had learned their craft in workshops across the Roman world, but the intricate work of placing thousands of tiny stone pieces was performed by slaves whose eyesight would be permanently damaged by the close work done in inadequate light. The kitchen complex, hidden from the main living areas but essential to the villa's functioning, reveals the infrastructure necessary to support Roman lifestyle in a frontier setting. Multiple cooking hearths, elaborate storage systems for preserved foods, and specialized rooms for bread making and wine preparation required constant labor from a staff of kitchen slaves who worked in shifts to ensure that meals were available whenever Fronto or his guests desired them. The hypercourse system that heated the villa through the winter months represents perhaps the most impressive example of skilled slave labor applied to Roman comfort. This underground network of heated air channels required precise engineering to distribute warmth evenly throughout the structure while preventing dangerous accumulations of carbon monoxide. The slaves who maintained this system worked in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, breathing smoke and cold dust that would gradually destroy their lungs while ensuring that their masters never experienced discomfort from the mountain cold. Fronto's personal chambers occupied the villa's most privileged location, with windows positioned to capture mountain views while remaining sheltered from winter winds. His bedroom featured walls painted with elaborate frescoes depicting idealized landscapes, Roman countryside scenes that bore no resemblance to the Dacian mountains visible from his windows. These paintings served as a form of psychological escape, allowing Fronto to maintain the illusion that he remained connected to the civilized world of Italy despite his frontier posting. The library, one of Fronto's particular prides, contained scrolls and codices imported at considerable expense from Rome and other centers of learning. Many of these works were copied by educated slaves who possessed the literacy and penmanship skills necessary for such delicate work. Ironically, some of these slave scribes were likely more educated than their master, having been captured from Dacian noble families that had maintained sophisticated literary traditions. The villa's gardens represented another form of cultural domination, as Roman plants and landscaping techniques were imposed upon the Dacian landscape with little regard for local growing conditions or natural beauty. Olive trees, struggling in the mountain climate, were maintained through elaborate systems of winter protection. Rose gardens required constant irrigation and soil amendment to produce the blooms that Fronto associated with proper Roman living. Grapevines, while more suitable to the local climate, were planted in rigid rows that maximized production while eliminating the natural beauty of the mountain slopes. The slave quarters, by contrast, were located in the least desirable areas of the villa complex, near the stables and workshops, downwind from the kitchen smoke, and positioned to receive minimal natural light or fresh air. These buildings were constructed with the same technical skill evident in the main villa but using the cheapest possible materials and most cramped possible layouts. A single room might house 6 to 8 slaves, with minimal furniture and no provision for privacy or personal possessions. The daily routine of villa slaves followed a schedule determined entirely by their master's needs and preferences. Kitchen slaves rose before dawn to prepare the morning meal and begin preparations for the elaborate dinners that were an essential part of Roman social life. Garden slaves worked from sunrise to sunset maintaining the extensive grounds, their labor time to ensure that Fronto never witnessed the unglamorous aspects of maintaining his carefully cultivated paradise. The entertainment of guests required coordinated efforts from dozens of slaves, each trained to perform specific roles that would create the impression of effortless luxury. Serving slaves learned to move silently through the dining room, anticipating needs without drawing attention to themselves. Musicians, often slaves who had been selected for their natural abilities and provided with training that increased their value, performed during meals while remaining essentially invisible to the diners they entertained. Fronto's correspondence, some of which survives in fragmentary form, reveals his perspective on slave management and the challenges of maintaining Roman lifestyle in a frontier province. He writes of the constant need to import skilled craftsmen and the difficulty of training local slaves to meet Roman standards of service. His complaints about the quality of local wine and the challenge of obtaining proper olive oil suggest a man struggling to maintain familiar comforts in an alien environment. Yet the same letters also reveal a casual acceptance of slave mortality that is chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. Fronto mentions the need to replace kitchen slaves who had died during a particularly harsh winter with no more emotion than he might discuss the replacement of worn-out tools or equipment. The slaves who died maintaining his comfort are remembered only as assets that required replacement, their individual humanity entirely erased from his accounting. The villa's bath complex, modeled on the great thermae of Rome but scaled to accommodate a private household, required constant maintenance by slaves who understood the complex systems of water heating, drainage, and ventilation that made Roman bathing culture possible. These slaves worked in steamy, poorly ventilated conditions while their masters enjoyed the luxury of heated pools and steam rooms that were meant to promote health and relaxation. The economic foundation that supported this lifestyle becomes clear when we examine the records of Fronto's mining operations. The silver extracted by slave labor in the mountains was sold to Roman merchants for prices that generated enormous profits, which were then invested in additional land, slaves, and luxury goods that further enhanced Fronto's status and comfort. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating, with slave labor generating the wealth necessary to purchase more slaves and expand operations. The religious practices of the villa reveal another layer of cultural domination and resistance. Fronto maintained a household shrine dedicated to traditional Roman gods, with daily offerings performed by specially trained slave priests who had been forced to abandon their own spiritual traditions to serve Roman deities. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that slaves found ways to maintain their own religious practices in hidden locations throughout the villa complex, creating secret shrines to Dacian gods in storage rooms and workshops. The seasonal rhythm of villa life followed Roman customs rather than local traditions, creating an artificial cycle that ignored the natural patterns of mountain life. Roman festivals were celebrated with elaborate feasts and entertainments that required weeks of preparation by the slave staff, while traditional Dacian seasonal observances were forbidden or ignored. This cultural suppression extended even to the calendar, as slaves were required to organize their lives around Roman timekeeping systems that bore no relationship to their ancestral ways of marking the passage of seasons. The education of young slaves within the villa system reveals the complex ways that Roman culture was transmitted and transformed. Promising children from slave families were sometimes provided with basic education that increased their value as household servants, but this education was strictly limited to skills that served Roman interests. Literacy was taught only to the extent necessary for specific duties, and any education in Dacian history or culture was strictly forbidden. As evening settles over the villa complex, the contrast between the two worlds becomes most pronounced. In the main building, Fronto and his guests recline on comfortable couches, enjoying elaborate meals served on fine pottery while discussing philosophy, politics, and literature. Oil lamps cast warm light on painted walls and polished marble floors, creating an atmosphere of cultured refinement that could rival any villa in Italy. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, exhausted workers gather around small fires for meals of bread and thin soup, speaking in whispered Dacian while carefully listening for the approach of overseers. Their conversations focus on survival rather than philosophy, on the health of sick friends rather than abstract political theory, on memories of lost families rather than literary criticism. The villa of Marcus Cornelius Fronto stands as a monument to the vast inequalities that characterized Roman society, but it also serves as a reminder of the human cost of imperial luxury. Every marble column, every painted wall, every carefully tended garden represents not just Roman wealth and sophistication, but also the labor, suffering, and cultural destruction that made such luxury possible. In the end, the villa's greatest irony may be that its beauty and grandeur, so carefully constructed to impress visitors and assert Roman superiority, was created entirely by the hands of people whose own cultural achievements were dismissed as barbarism. The enslaved Dacians who built this monument to Roman civilization possessed skills, knowledge, and artistic traditions that equaled or exceeded those of their masters, yet their contributions were systematically erased from the official record. The stones of Fronto's villa have long since been scattered or incorporated into later buildings, but the pattern it represents, wealth built upon forced labor, luxury sustained by suffering, and cultural domination disguised as civilization, echoes through history as a reminder of humanity's capacity for both great beauty and great cruelty, often existing side by side in the same time and place. As our journey through the shadows of Roman Dacia draws to a close, we find ourselves returning to the present moment, to the comfort of your own surroundings and the freedom to rest without fear of dawn's harsh awakening. The stories we have explored together, of daily survival in the mines, of failed rebellion and its consequences, of anonymous graves that preserve dignity in death, and of the stark contrasts between luxury and suffering, remind us of the resilience of the human spirit even in history's darkest chapters. The enslaved Dacians whose lives we have glimpsed tonight were not merely victims of historical forces beyond their control. They were individuals who found ways to maintain their humanity, their connections to one another, and their hope for something better, even when hope seemed impossible. In their whispered conversations, their hidden burial goods, their quiet acts of mutual care, and their willingness to risk everything for the possibility of freedom, we see reflections of the same fundamental human desires that motivate us today. Their world has long since passed into history, the mines sealed, the villas crumbled, the chains rusted away to nothing. Yet something of their experience remains with us, not to disturb our rest, but to deepen our appreciation for the freedoms we possess and the choices we are able to make. In remembering their struggles, we honor not only their memory but also our own good fortune to live in times when such systematic dehumanization is no longer accepted as the natural order of things. Let their stories fade gently now as you settle into the peaceful darkness of your own safe space. The mountains of ancient Dacia are quiet under starlight, the quarries filled with wildflowers, the burial grounds peaceful under the protection of time and distance. Sleep well, knowing that their long struggle is ended, and that your own rest comes without the weight of shackles or the fear of tomorrow's forced labor. The past whispers its lessons softly, then lets you go in peace.